Welcome to the Age of Fission radio show with your host, Lonnie Clark, where we constantly remind you that love is greater than fear and happiness is resistance. I'm going to read to you again, number 3 chapter. The title of the book is The New Nuclear Danger, George W. Bush's Military-Industrial Complex. I think that's actually maybe a miss. It's not George W. Bush's. He was their servant, Dr. Caldicott. That's what I think. Anyways, I'm going to take my glasses off so I can see way better and put the stuff up to my face. So, Chapter 3, It's a Mad, Mad World. Nuclear scientists and the Pentagon play with deadly gadgets. Now, this is why I wanted to read this book to you guys, because imagine now with the lunatic in the White House having access to this stuff. This is why we have to keep our vibrations on love and forgiveness, and it's really important that we love each other, cease name-calling. I do call him Traitor Trump because he's a traitor. I refuse to call him president. He's not a president. He's a traitor. And I'm dumbfounded that people in this country think he's fighting the deep state and he's going after the FBI, like the FBI is after him. Like that lack of concept of the complexity of what is going on. The disgrace that he had yesterday over it was so apparent he had not read the indictments, which I tell everybody, please do read the indictments, because that's what makes this stuff so important. Do people really believe that Vladimir Putin is not like doing his best to compete with the United States? And we know the lunatics are running the show here, so. Okay, It's a Mad, Mad World. Chapter 3, It's a Mad, Mad World. Nuclear scientists in the Pentagon play with deadly gadgets. We were fascinated by abstract violence on a huge scale. I became addicted to nuclear weapons work. It gave me a sense of great power. I remember dreams about weapons design that I had been working on, and when it failed, it was a nightmare. When I succeeded, it was a high, that sense of, I'm good at this. It's my bomb. Except we never called them bombs. We called them gadgets. That's from Ted Taylor, former bomb designer. Nuclear scientists have been called priests or monks by the media or public in awe of their inventions. Most journalists and policymakers therefore assume that the scientific activities within the weapons labs are sacrosanct and beyond question. Because of the almost mystical power these individuals are granted, they have dominated the national security scene since the Manhattan Project began in 1942. Virtually unimpeded and uncontrolled, over a period of 50 years, they designed 65 different types of nuclear weapons, exploded 1,030 bombs at the testing site in Nevada, and directed the manufacture of over 70,000 bombs. Just in Nevada, over 1,000 bombs. As noted above, 1,000 bombs exploding over 1,000 cities could induce nuclear winter and end most life on the earth. These scientists have always operated in absolute secrecy, which gave them the anonymity they needed to pursue their work. They used a language that was incomprehensible to all but the most educated. And like physicians, they hid behind an arcane scientific complexity, never emerging to inform the world what they were doing. They still operate the 3 major nuclear weapons labs, Los Alamos and Sandia in New Mexico, and Lawrence Livermore in California. All were currently run by the Department of Energy and overseen by the University of California. While most Americans do know that the DOE supervises U.S. energy policy, few are aware that the same department also oversees all nuclear weapons research. I'm going to tell you what this book was written, and I believe it was 2004. The book was written in 2002. Wow. It's been a short 16 years, but boy, has it been long, huh? We've come up. We've actually sunk to a new low in this country. It's disgusting. Okay. At the end of the Cold War, nuclear scientists saw their future slipping away from them. The euphemistically named Stockpile Stewardship and Management Program, SS&M, was a way to ensure their continued employment. Ostensibly created to ensure that old weapons will still explode if necessary, the labs are actually designing, testing, and building a variety of new nuclear weapons, many in violation of existing treaties and bans. See Chapter 5 for a full discussion of the SS&M charade. We will, sister, we will. At a political level, the situations have been able to associate their works with nationalism and the preservation and protection of the United States. Let me read that sentence again. At a political level, the scientists have been able to associate their work with nationalism and preservation and protection of the United States. Yet it is doubtful that any of the individuals involved, from the politicians mandated to guide and direct these scientists on our behalf to the scientists themselves, the military personnel, or the businessmen who profit from the nuclear weapons enterprise, understand the philosophical, moral, spiritual, and biological problems engendered by capturing gigantic extraterrestrial forces manifested only in the sun and the stars. So let's read that again. Yet it is doubtful that any of the individuals involved, from the politicians mandated to guide and direct these scientists on our behalf to the scientists themselves, the military personnel, or the businessmen who profit from the nuclear weapons enterprise, understand the philosophical, moral, spiritual, or biological problems engendered by capturing gigantic extraterrestrial forces manifested only in the sun and the stars. Wow. Gigantic extraterrestrial forces manifested only in the sun and the stars. Let us begin with the nuclear scientists. Thousands of physicists, chemists, and engineers, the cream of the crop, recruited from U.S. colleges over a period of 60 years. Brilliant, rational, careful, strictly scientific, engaged in exploring the very elements of creation, and all committed to the design, construction, and testing of nuclear weapons. Surprisingly, while many are in the right of the political spectrum, others are liberal in their views. They do not believe that designing bombs is an act of patriotism, as the right-wingers do, but are drawn to the culture in a low-key, rational speak, their term for strictly rational discussion, bereft of emotional overtones, and find joy in scientific problem-solving. The Lawrence Livermore Lab has a policy that if an employee expresses any concern about the ultimate result of the use of nuclear weapons, i.e., possible destruction of the world, they are advised and sometimes required to see a counselor. Really? In a scenario right out of 1984 and a classic sign of a cult mentality, anyone giving voice to the stark truth must be counseled to accept the lie of the labs. Let us highlight that phrase, lie of the labs. Wow. The counsel to accept. Wow. That's what's going on today in the United States. With Donald Trump coming out today saying, I didn't mean why would they want to attack us? I meant wouldn't. I would not. No, don't worry. I'm not stabbing you in the back, folks. Right out of 1984. Cults also typically withhold information from potential recruits to conceal the true nature of the group or the work with which it is involved. Thus, when Dr. Andreas Toupadakis, Toupadakis, a chemist who became an employee of the Lawrence Livermore Nuclear Weapons Lab in 1988, he was led to believe that he would be working on environmental cleanup and nuclear disarmament. In fact, as he gradually realized, he was participating in an ongoing nuclear arms race, and he became agitated and deeply concerned. Toupadakis was advised to see a counselor shortly before he left Lawrence Livermore Lab in January 2000. Wow. Since the 1940s, the scientific bomb cult has allowed individual scientists to design and test their very own bombs. If the testing proved successful, it was a rite of passage for the newcomer. More experienced members have attested to gaining a sense of power over the forces of nature while renewing their stature. Bomb designers often slept alone in a room above the Nevada test site with the control mechanisms that would trigger the explosion the next day, like a race car driver flirting with death, and in this case, not just individual death, but the death of millions, the death of life. At a more fundamental level, these scientists felt that their technical mastery over the bomb implied that they would then be able to control the impending annihilation that their work signified. But in psychological terms, the mastery they had acquired actually implied that they had an intense fear of the bomb and of death. Interestingly, the language of the scientists reflects the imagery of birth and new life, denoting more profound psychological dynamics. The first nuclear bomb ever tested in 1945, codenamed Trinity, after the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost, was called Oppenheimer's baby, in honor of the murderer, that's my word, in honor of the scientific director of the Manhattan Project. The telegram Edward Teller sent to Los Alamos after the first successful A-bomb in 1944 read, "It's a boy." The bomb gets, quote, married, unquote, to the diagnostic canister, and it explodes. And as it explodes, it, quote, couples with the ground, making, quote, daughter fusion products, unquote, that pass through, quote, generations, quote. One of the scientists described that the test was like having a baby and compared the tenseness he experienced during the test to whether to push or not. Another bomb designer compared his post-test feelings to that of postnatal depression. The anthropologist Hugh Gusterson, in his book Nuclear Rights, surmises that to the scientists, nuclear weapons tests symbolize not despair, destruction, and death, but hope, renewal, and life, and therefore nuclear weapons must be part of the natural order. Perhaps at a subliminal level, these scientists, almost exclusively men, are seeking an archetypal understanding of the experience of conception and delivery, otherwise unavailable to them. Well, I don't know. I think we've cracked that bubble. There's plenty enough female scientists that are into nuclear. The ultimate destruction of the creation is, in their minds, analogous to creation itself. Oppenheimer quoted the Bhagavad Gita upon witnessing Trinity, the first nuclear explosion. "I am become death, the shatterer of worlds." On the other hand, unlike the nurturing instincts of a new mother, much of their new language reflects their profound dehumanization of people. To them, people are human resources and components within a system. They describe human communication as interfacing and miscommunications as disconnects. The pain of human injuries is described as a damage, and when a human being is killed, she is disabled. The Pentagon echoes this language, calling targetings of cities counter-value targeting. People are dubbed soft targets. Missile silos are hard targets. The 15 million civilians who would initially be killed in the counterforce attack on Russian hard targets are collateral damage. Wow. As Gustafsson writes, techno-strategic discourse is characterized by its lack of emotion, its game theoretical model of human motivation, its fondness for abstraction and for passive sentence construction, its focus on hardware rather than people, and its fundamental unquestioned and unquestionable assumptions that weapons development must continue, and its fundamental unquestioned and unquestionable assumptions that weapons developments must continue. Exactly. As they remove pain and fear from their vocabulary, presumably the scientists are protecting their psyches from the human consequences of their work. At the same time, however, they wax lyrical about their weapons, describing nuclear equipment as beautiful and their relationships to technology as zen. Humans are arms, bombs are warheads. A nuclear attack is a decapitating strike. A strategic nuclear force has 3 legs, early warning satellites with eyes and ears. Missiles are covered with skins, and aging weapons grow whiskers that can interfere with their health. And all of these things are in quotes. I decided not to keep going, quote unquote, unquote. Superimposed upon the humanization of nuclear weapons and the mechanization of human bodies is the culture of careful, expert rationalization. That's what happens on Fox News and MSNBC. I don't think CNN, a lot of those people are too emotional, but the other one, yeah. Superimposed upon the humanization of nuclear weapons and the mechanization of human bodies is the culture of careful, expert rationalism. I beg your pardon, you guys. Very similar to the rational language used by the physicians to distance themselves from the almost unbearable human pain and suffering they deal with on a daily basis. One obvious difference, however, is that while physicians deal with pain already existing in their patients, these scientists create the source of their pain. The psychological pain these scientists must then confront is self-imposed. New subtitle: Military Madness and the Pentagon Cult. You start talking about targeting or strategic command and control, and baby, that's the family jewels. That's a quote from General Mac Merritt, former director of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Wow. According to retired Admiral Eugene Carroll, inter-service rivalry is the real engine of the nuclear arms race. The 3 services under the direction of the Pentagon, each competing for the nuclear dollar. It's about power building, each wanting and demanding more planes, bombs, and ships. This competition among the services, a dynamic centered at the mental and psychological age of my grandchildren, age 8, 7, and 5, who argue continuously and competitively about toys, all wanting their very own and never having enough, may have been socially and politically acceptable during World War I and II in the pre-nuclear era. In a world bristling with nuclear weapons, such rivalry is calamitous. Any military skirmish in an interdependent world involving the Navy, the Army, and the Air Force could escalate and trigger a thermonuclear holocaust. Indeed, all nuclear war games played by the Pentagon end up obliterating both the victors and the vanquished. In this context, it is interesting to examine the powerful political role that the Pentagon has played since the Cold War ended. Wow. The new international scenario in which the Pentagon was left without a major national enemy at the end of the Cold War in 1989 came as a shock to the entrenched military establishment, which was faced with a kind of post-traumatic stress syndrome. Indeed, many individuals overtly mourned the loss of their once predictable former enemy. We've kind of sewed that one up since then, right? To the contrary, in the face of the newfound opportunity, President Bush displayed commendable leadership, defying the Pentagon in pressure and moving decisively and unilaterally to eliminate all ground-based tactical missile bombs, all tactical nuclear weapons from naval vessels, and all hydrogen bombs from long-range bombers. He also canceled certain long-range missile programs. He de-escalated both as a gesture of goodwill and as a strategic defense maneuver, as he explained to one of his former aides at the time. I want tactical nuclear weapons out of Europe. Gorbachev needs U.S. cover to get their nukes out of the Republic before they collapse. Wow. At the same, think of this. At the same time, then Secretary of Defense evil Dick Cheney and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff backstabber Colin Powell instigated I beg your pardon, I added those comments about that. Sorry, Dr. Caldicott. Instigated a full-scale review of the Single Integrated Operation Plan, the SIOP, the U.S. nuclear targeting strategy that was the guiding light of the Pentagon, but that had now been rendered obsolete. Both men were appalled by the subsequent report. Not only was SIOP arcane and hopelessly out of date, but it also lacked clear logic and objectives. According to one account, Cheney concluded that SIOP was not a nuclear war plan. It seemed like a jumble of processed data. Every time the Pentagon had bought a new nuclear weapons system to match the Soviets, Omaha, the Strategic Command headquarters in Omaha, Nebraska, had simply found targets for the added warheads and rearranged the SIOP math formulas. This had gone on for years as captains and majors who wrote the SIOP plan rotated in and rotated out. This dynamic was so out of control that by 1986, SIOP had targeted 16,000 nuclear facilities in the Soviet Union. At a point of comparison, there were only 240 major cities in the entire Northern Hemisphere. We have gotten super screwed by these guys, you guys. This cost a lot of money, 16,000. Okay, following the Cheney-Powell review, thousands of targets in the former Soviet Republic were removed from the SIOP plans, and all focused targets were now located in Russia, which was fast becoming an ally. The targets still included command and control centers, conventional forces, all war-supporting industries, including such things as shoe factories and most other factories, including gas and oil facilities, power plants, rail stations, schools, universities, in addition to actual nuclear forces. So there was overkill, but less overkill. Bush continued to take command of nuclear weapons policies, never allowing the military bureaucracy to prevail in decision-making. He counted on his main advisors, who were astute inside players, to carry out his objectives, and they received powerful presidential support in the face of Pentagon opposition. Could you imagine the traitor doing this? You guys are aware that Donald Trump has abdicated his responsibility to oversee the Pentagon. I digress again. Indeed, one military official from the Joint Strategic Planning Service charged that officials in prior administrations were criminally negligent for their lack of oversight for the SIOP. All of the details of nuclear targeting strategy have been left to junior officers in the Pentagon. What? In an elusive consensus, Jan Nolan describes the years before the first Bush administration as follows. Briefings to senior officials about the SIOP typically were perfunctory and often unintelligible. The thousands of pages of SIOP data and computer codes contained in the plans would be translated into an hour-long briefing and presented in several dozen view graphs. Generally, no one at the briefings wanted to ask questions because they didn't want to embarrass themselves, according to one account in the reference to both military and political authorities. We would cut deals as junior officers of the different services and in allocating weapons. Sometimes this resulted in the remarkable changes of the guidance, which would have been reviewed at the highest level. Wow. Once, while being briefed on the PSYOP, then Secretary of Defense Cheney began squirming uncomfortably in his chair as he watched Moscow, which had been targeted with 200 separate hydrogen bombs, entailing an enormous excess of megatonnage, turn slowly into a solid red mass covered over and over again with ludicrous targets. The Pentagon thinks about nuclear strategy in a strange and pathological way. One could possibly diagnose the attitudes of the Pentagon as clinically sick and suggest that all people who subscribe to these theories need urgent counseling and therapy. Aggression by an enemy will be deterred with the threat to vaporize millions of people, as Joanne Nolan comments in her book. The rationale is as follows. Officers responsible for nuclear weapons must have the ability to hold at risk anything that an adversary would, quote, most value. But because those doing the targeting cannot know what is most valued, almost everything is held at risk. As one officer was heard to say, if he values his grandma, we have to target grandmas. While the Bush administration's bequeathed an activist legacy to potent arms controls and unilateral disarmament programs to the next president, this tradition was not perpetrated by President Clinton. Of course not. He's a freaking... Clinton vacillated. Of course. Clinton vacillated. He's the biggest coward. He makes me sick. I have to read his name, don't I? He's all over the place here. Ugh. Okay, let's get back to this. When the Bush administration bequeathed his activist legacy of potent arms control and unilateral disarmament programs to the next president, this tradition was not perpetrated by President Clinton. Clinton vacillated and was ever reluctant to engage himself directly in nuclear issues. And Clinton simply never took command of the Pentagon, of course not. As one of Bush's aides said, Clinton debates objectives with his subordinates. Bush debates tactics, but never objectives. Clinton's first Secretary of Defense, Les Aspin, a former chairman of the House Armed Services Committee, was highly experienced in the area of nuclear weapons strategies. Aspin had doubts about the relevance of a nuclear deterrence in the post-Cold War era. A world without nuclear weapons would actually be better. Nuclear weapons are still the big equalizer, but the United States is not the equalizer, but the equalizee. To this end, Aspin initiated a nuclear posture review based upon the concepts of mutual assured safety and cooperative denuclearization. That's where we're at right now. The review was to encompass and incorporate policies, doctrines, force structure, operations, safety, security, and arms control, and was to include a critique by an outside panel of experts. Aspin specifically planned the review to emphasize the fundamental political character of nuclear policy. However, there was strong opposition from Pentagon officials who decided that outside participation would not be necessary or desirable. As one commented, we certainly weren't about to invite any weirdos from the ACDA, the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency. Aspin resigned in 1994, shortly before he died, and the responsibility for the review passed on to the Deputy Secretary of Defense, John Deutsch, oh my God, a relatively inexperienced man who had recently been appointed from the private military sector. He was later appointed head of the CIA. Operational responsibility for the review was shared by Ashton Carter, Assistant Secretary for National Security and Proliferation, and Lieutenant General Barry McCaffrey, who became Clinton's drug czar. Don't you love these words, drug czar? Barry McCaffrey, he's that guy that's always on TV. Aspin's instructions to the nuclear posture review had been to extricate the entrenched nuclear establishment, including the Pentagon, from its obsolete Cold War preoccupations to foster more appropriate understandings of the post-Cold War reality. The military establishment, Aspen believed, needed to accept and understand the enormous dangers of the U.S. nuclear strategy. But in the absence of senior oversight and disciplined leadership, once Aspen resigned, the review process failed. President Clinton declined to become involved. Secretary of State Warren Christopher was disengaged, and National Security Advisor Anthony Lake was uninterested. So the job was left essentially to Deutsch and Carter. Carter, who was well-intentioned, sincerely believed that a process of logical analysis could alter orthodox military thinking about nuclear weapons strategy. To this end, he established 6 working groups, staffed by mid-ranking and junior military officers, plus career bureaucrats. Most had little background in nuclear strategy, and all met in closed-door meetings within the Pentagon. Their attitude was derisive to any, quote, outsider analysis, unquote, and new ideas were giving polite but frosty receptions. The Pentagon personnel overwhelmingly opposed any changes to their triad of nuclear forces and to the concept of de-alerting their strategic nuclear weapons. The Air Force also strenuously resisted eliminating their land-based ICBM weapons. The other charged that any change in their strategy of employing a variety of launch options threatened America's ability to respond to nuclear attacks effectively. Some military officers also sensed an assault on their nuclear procedures and their lines of authority. As one mid-level officer asserted, "We know how to produce nuclear plans. We have the methodology. We can analyze damage expectancies." The vice chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral William Owens, who oversaw the committee, was a potent critic of nuclear weapons. But unfortunately, he did not challenge his colleagues when they vigorously opposed the mandate of the review. Even when consensus was reached by the Pentagon, however, the White House never at any stage attempted to engage or educate the Congress about these extraordinary important issues. That's because he was too busy with interns. Essentially, after 10 months of review process, the working group sabotaged Aspen's original concept, opposing even minor changes or innovations. Instead, they produced analyses and a new series of view graphs totally supporting the structure, doctrine, and force levels implicit in the current nuclear doctrine. Carter became so frustrated that he bypassed the working group and appointed 2 outsiders to rescue the program: Steve Fetter, a physicist and a professor from the University of Maryland, and Lieutenant Commander Leo McKay, who wrote his Harvard doctoral dissertation on nuclear strategy. He organized high-level clearances in order to give them full access to the necessary documents. This counter-review was specifically structured to analyze the possible removal of land-based ICBMs vulnerable to first strike, de-alerting of strategic weapons, removal of the remaining U.S. nuclear weapons in Europe, there were still 200, and altering the nuclear targeting doctrines. Post-Cold War, it was obvious, at least to Carter, that America could operate with a much smaller strategic nuclear arsenal, if indeed it needed one at all. Deutsch expressed sympathy to these proposals, but when the Joint Chiefs of Staff got wind of their briefing charts, a revolt was triggered in the Pentagon. They're like, hell no, you're not getting rid of the best things we've ever discovered. Although Carter had been appointed to oversee the nuclear posture review by the Office of the Secretary of Defense, in the end he was abandoned to do solitary battle against the power and might of the Pentagon. A meeting called by the regional commanders to call ash on the carpet progressed to such a brutal showdown Carter had no authority to present options to the Secretary of Defense, they said, unless the options had been approved by the so-called working groups. Though Carter defended himself, saying it was not appropriate for colonels and lower-level Pentagon personnel to craft U.S. national policies, the policy that was finally given approval by the disengaged president was a complete triumph for the Pentagon. It was called a, quote, lead and hedge, unquote, strategy, in which the U.S. would publicly pursue nuclear arms control while at the same time hedging against a return to an authoritarian military regime in Russia hostile to the United States. Oh my God. That's Trader Trump's complete attitude. In the end, this new policy allowed America to retain its nuclear weapons should the Cold War reemerge, to double the number of strategic intercontinental weapons allowed under the START II treaty from 3,000 to 6,000. And there were to be no limits on non-deployed warheads, nuclear weapons in storage, or tactical nuclear weapons. Tactical nuclear weapons are not delivered by intercontinental missiles or intercontinental planes, but are launched from short-range missiles, cruise missiles, or short-range planes. Finally, the policy reinforced the triad of land, air, and sea-based weapons. Ashton Carter had since disclaimed that there was really any genuine attempt to alter U.S. force structure of the overall nuclear policy. So really what they did was they just reinforced what they were doing. Said, yep, we're good. Let's just get more weapons, huh? The Pentagon had prevailed. There was no change in the nuclear policy, and the status quo of nuclear comfort returned. When the review was released, one Russian commentator observed, regarding the lack of leadership displayed in the face of the Pentagon's post-review tantrum, Clinton's foreign policy is determined by immediate reactions to internal and, to a less degree, external factors. Wow. Clinton's foreign policy is determined by immediate reactions to internal and, to lesser degrees, external factors. That's kind of what happened. Well, we're at the end of this chapter. The next chapter is going to be chapter 4. I'm going to end here, but boy, this really infuriated me. But it really makes me think about that they're all playing the same game. I mean, this was written 12 years ago, but we could just substitute Trader Trump's name for Clinton. Wow, humans are so predictable. Chapter 4, Corporate Madness and the Death Merchants. I see in the near future a crisis approaching that unnerves me and causes me to tremble for the sake of my country. Corporations have been enthroned, and an era of corruption in high places will follow, and the money power of the country will endeavor to prolong its reign by working upon the prejudices of the people until all wealth is aggregated in a few hands and the republic is destroyed. Abraham Lincoln, November 21, 1864. Who runs the Congress all these years later? The transnational corporations whose executives wine and dine, woo and bribe, and corrupt the office holders of the White House and Congress, from the president and the vice president to almost all the elected congressional officials. These all-powerful corporations manipulate and control most of the federal legislation, foreign and domestic, that passes through Congress. They do it through a variety of mechanisms: think tanks, corporate mergers, lobbying, political donations. Think tanks. In the 70s, leading international corporations organized and endowed a series of think tanks, their own battle management organizations, whose primary purpose was to sway popular and political opinion in directions useful to the think tank's corporate sponsors. These think tanks are staffed by erudite researchers who produce editorials, TV news pieces, papers, media releases, and legislative material which are well conceived, well researched, well written, easy to understand, and very acceptable to the media and Congress. Production of this material is orchestrated in a timely fashion to guide specific pieces of legislation. Mostly Washington-based, these think tanks also have a pervasive presence in the media, their spokespeople being regular political commentators on the Sunday morning talk shows and in print. And we all know them. This is my commentary. We do all know them. They're all on all the mainstream media shows. They all go on regularly. Treetops Propaganda. That's a new subtitle. If the mass will be free of the chains and iron, it must obey the chains of silver. If it will not love, honor, and obey, it must not expect to escape seduction. That was a quote by Harold Laswell, leading American scholar of propaganda, 1939. This broad-reaching, sophisticated, high-level manipulation of the so-called free democratic media and legislature is known as treetops propaganda, and it has been extraordinarily successful for sponsoring corporations and the points of view they espouse. Such an approach effectively controls government agendas in many countries, certainly including the United States, and it is more effective by far than grassroots organizing for all but the very few issues around which millions of concerned citizens can be mobilized. The right-wing think tanks almost alone created the new conservative movement of the 1970s. But these think tanks are neither free nor democratic. They are non-elected, private bodies controlled by wealthy, powerful corporations. In effect, they are advertising agencies acting for the corporations that founded and fund them. They represent the corporate philosophy of economic rationalism, which favors the corporate takeover of all public enterprises. Hey, this is their program. This is what we're watching. Now we know the answer of how Donald Trump got his economic plan. Okay, let's start again. Which favors the corporate takeover of all public enterprises, from healthcare and education to water and electricity, and an agenda that includes decreasing or abolishing government regulations of big business, decreasing corporate taxes and taxes for the rich, destroying the unions and increasing corporate profits. This really does, honest to God, you guys, sound like the tax cut plan of 2017. Back to the book. The IMF, the World Bank, GATT, NAFTA, NAFTA, APEC, FTAA, and WTO, World Trade Order, have all taken their cues from these think tanks. Sarah Scaife Foundation, the Heritage Foundation's income from 1999 was $43.6 million. The Heritage Foundation established a comprehensive list of agenda items for the Reagan presidency, which they titled Mandate for Leadership, Policy Management in a Conservative Administration, unquote. Items included arming America to fight and win a nuclear war and to develop superiority over the Soviet Union. Most of these agenda items became policy. In quotes she has, in parentheses. They followed up by issuing another mandate for leadership in Reagan's second term. One of the most influential think tanks is the Heritage Foundation, funded by transnational corporations and wealthy individuals, including Amway, Hyundai, Exxon, Philip Morris, United Parcel Service Foundation, Joseph Coors, Timothy Mellon, and the Sarah Scaife Foundation. The Heritage Foundation's income for 1999 was $43.6 million. The Heritage Foundation established a comprehensive list of agenda items for the Reagan presidency, which was titled Mandate for Leadership, Policy Management in a Conservative Administration. Items included arming America to fight and win a nuclear war and to develop superiority over the Soviet Union. Most of these agenda items became policy. They followed up by issuing another mandate for leadership in Reagan's second term. I know, we're their victims, but I can't help but laugh about this. We have just been easy pickings for them, folks. And I want to thank Dr. Caldicott for writing this book. I just cannot tell you how much I appreciate her making the effort to do this. Back to her book, speaking of, and the title of this book, again, is The New Nuclear Danger, subtitled George W. Bush's Military-Industrial Complex by Dr. Helen Caldicott. I thought I'd throw that in. Think Tanks and the Military-Industrial Complex, new subtitle. The think tanks exert a huge amount of influence on behalf of the military-industrial complex. The Heritage Foundation is still very much involved in promoting the nuclear arms race in all arenas and actively lobbying for Star Wars. Other powerful right-wing think tanks that involve themselves in American nuclear security include the American Enterprise Institute and the Cato Institute. Yet another think tank, the Center for Security Policy, serves as the nerve center for the Star Wars lobby. It was organized by Frank Gaffney, a Pentagon official under Reagan, and a high priest of missile defense. She has like an asterisk here, and there's some information that I think we should read at the bottom of the page when she was talking about the think tanks, and I'm going to read it. In January 1998, a chief World Bank economist, Joseph Stiglitz, attracted worldwide attention during a lecture he gave in Helsinki when he criticized this so-called Washington Consensus. Stiglitz pointed out that Washington-inspired austerity, privatization, and deregulation, which has become the standard policy prescription for much of the world, was misguided and often disastrous. He said that market ideologues were using economic crisis in various countries as excuses to discredit government intervention and to promote more market liberalization. He argued, contrary to economic rationalist line, that moderate inflation is fairly harmless. Budget deficits are not necessarily evil. Privatization is not a panacea, and deregulation of domestic and international banking markets can do serious harm. Not surprisingly, he was fired from the World Bank at the end of 1999. Okay then. It was organized by Frank Gaffney, a Pentagon official under Reagan, and a high priest of missile defense. Gaffney also heads the Coalition to Protect Americans, now a group that organizes TV ads to promote missile defense and all-out Star Wars. One ad depicts visions of babies in their cradles and children playing baseball, interspersed with missiles falling from the sky, and the caption reading, "Where will you be when the missiles are launched?" Fear, 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 fear. Let's get back to the book. CPS is funded by military contractors including Lockheed Martin, Boeing, TRW, General Dynamics, Rockwell International, and Northrop Grumman. CSP's board includes 6 Lockheed Martin executives, members of the Heritage Foundation, President Reagan's senior advisor, Kenneth K. Worth, 2 staunch Republican supporters of missile defense, Senator John Kyle of Arizona and Representative Kurt Weldon of Pennsylvania, and the notorious and now elderly Edward Teller, the inventor of the hydrogen bomb. Oh my God, I have to stop here. These people, all 3 of these people mentioned, I'm glad those 2 people are no longer in Congress. Edward Teller was a murderer. And I apologize to Dr. Caldicott for inserting that, but if anybody's ever seen a picture of this guy, he is a straight up lunatic. And once I found out about this nuclear thing was out of control and I started looking into it, look at pictures of Edward Teller. He is not a rationally sane human being. You can see it in his face. And it is beyond comprehension that they allowed him anywhere near our government decisions. Okay, Edward Teller, inventor of the hydrogen bomb. Teller calls Star Wars the 3rd generation of nuclear weapons, the atomic bomb being the first and the hydrogen bomb being the second. For 32 years, he has urged the nuclear weapons labs to conduct more research on defensive weapons. The CSP packs a powerful corporate punch, publishing over 200 press releases a year, euphemistically called National Security Decision Briefs. In 1998, the Center for Security Policy gave its Keeper of the Flame Award to Donald Rumsfeld, former Defense Secretary under Ford and now Secretary of Defense in the present Bush administration. Other notable recipients of the award have included Ronald Reagan and Newt Gingrich. But even as early as 1983, when Reagan, under Edward Teller's guidance, gave his speech advocating Star Wars, most credible scientists knew that the scientific hypotheses upon which the theory was based, that a comprehensive and effective missile shield could be built, was simply unworkable. $70 billion and a string of uninterrupted technical failures later, the Center for Security Policy, the Heritage Foundation, Lockheed Martin, TRW, Raytheon, and Boeing remain committed to Star Wars and the concept, and the country is still trying to build a missile shield. And here we are, folks, in 2018, and what did Trader Trump just announce? Ooh, Space Force. I've been thinking, like the Air Force, like the Army, we need a Space Force, so he can claim it as his idea. He would love that. Back to the book. New subtitle. How the Think Tanks Resuscitated Star Wars. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, it became necessary for the corporations, their think tanks, the State Department, and the Pentagon to invent new excuses to justify this unworkable, enormously expensive military scientific adventure. First, new arch enemies had to be found, and North Korea, a country unable to feed its own people, was the propaganda machine's number one choice. Originally labeled along with Iraq a rogue state by the State Department and now called a state of concern, North Korea does not have a single missile that could hit the U.S., nor any nuclear weapons. So check this out, folks. That book, when was this book? Let's hear this again. No nuclear weapons as of 2002, when Helen Caldicott wrote this book. George W. Bush stopped inspections in North Korea during his first few years as president, and now they have over a dozen nuke weapons. So let's get back to this book, because this is how rapidly things change. And these statements are actually also which highlight why I want to read this book to you, because people need to know this stuff. This has just kind of gotten lost by the wayside, folks. This is really important to put into historical context. Less than 16 years ago, North Korea had no nuclear weapons. Now they have over a dozen. They say, oh, they have over a dozen. They don't tell us how many, but they have over a dozen. Okay, back to the book of Dr. Caldicott. Now, if I can find my place. Sorry. Okay, so that's where she says, okay. John Pike, then with the Federation of American Scientists, commenting on the North Korean missile test site, said, "This facility was not intended to support, and in many respects is incapable of supporting, the extension test program that would be needed to develop a reliable missile program. The site has no transportation links, no paved roads, no shortage facilities, no storage facilities for propellant, and no staff housing. Nevertheless, the ongoing demonical representation of North Korea is important to the Pentagon because it has been and is used to justify the only U.S. military deployment on mainland Asia. The U.S. maintains 37,000 troops in South Korea. Adherence to this policy is essential because it gives the U.S. a reason to maintain a military presence and a belligerent policy in an Asian country while it currently positions itself to cast China as the next major enemy on the horizon. Though recently Afghanistan has, on an acute basis, replaced China as a major Pentagon focus. Consequently, the Pentagon, State Department, and military industry have worked with other leading think tanks to make the public case for the need to defend the U.S. from this rogue state. So important has the North Korean threat been to U.S. military policy that William Cohen's first question to policy officials when he became Secretary of Defense in 1994 was, how can we change the assumption that U.S. troops will be withdrawn after peace comes to the Korean Peninsula? Unfortunately, this enemy is not behaving according to plan. For one thing, North Korean President Kim Jong-il and South Korean President Kim Dae-jung signed a peace treaty on June 15, 2000, agreeing that they needed reconciliation and establishment of peace. A military officer who closely follows the situation noticed that the U.S., in my opinion, is obsessed with the status quo and said that the Pentagon was underestimating the potential for a peace breakthrough and resisting changes in its forces in South Korea that could ease tensions further. North Korea even informed Russian President Putin that it would abandon its fledgling missile program in exchange for Western aid in building scientific satellites. But the State Department remained less convinced. As one department spokesman insisted, the threat of war is still there. In terms of the North Korean military capability, they still have over 1 million troops ready to go. 1 million underfed, starving, ready to defect. 1 million troops ready to defect, yeah. These people are evil. Actually, maybe this is the answer why they allowed North Korea to get the nuke weapon. Because now that North Korea has a nuclear weapon, they are definitely a threat to the United States. And in the spring of 1999, despite the problems brought on by Korean peacemaking, the Star Wars partisans claimed success. Their prodigious lobbying efforts, corporate political donations, and propaganda exercises persuaded the House and Senate to pass legislation stating that the official policy of the United States government is to deploy a national missile defense as soon as technically feasible. A Pentagon intelligence report quoted in the New York Times in September 2000 concluded that, quote, North Korea remains a dangerous military threat, unquote. That was before they got the nuke weapons, folks. And when Kim Dae-jung, a Nobel Peace Prize laureate, visited George W. Bush soon after Bush's inauguration, he was essentially snubbed by the president and his staff. Well, that's the end of tonight's reading. We stopped on page 29 of chapter 4, Corporate Madness and the Death Merchants, Corporate Mergers and Nuclear Policy is the new subtitle. You have been listening to Lonnie Clark in the Age of Fission radio show. I want to thank you for joining us. The Age of Fission radio show brings you book readings, pertinent articles, interviews with both activists and victims of nuclear and environmental contamination. We strive to deliver only the facts from reliable sources. We want to remind you that love is greater than fear, and happiness is resistance. Our dedication to love and happiness paves the road for innovation and healing. As we face our harsh reality, let us hold each other up and rejoice in our humanity. If you want to comment, please send your thoughts to ageoffission@gmail.com. That's AGEOFFISSION @gmail.com. To your host, Lonnie Clark.